A shocking criminal enterprise in America began to unravel in the spring of 1829 when a tenant farmer near the Delaware-Maryland border made a grim discovery in his fields. His plow horse suddenly fell into the earth, revealing a wooden chest buried just beneath the soil. Inside the chest, authorities found the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, the bones yellowed with age, and the skull bearing clear evidence of violence. This finding was merely the start. Over the following weeks, the bodies of at least 7 people, including 3 children, would be uncovered on this property. They were all victims of a woman whose name, Martha Opatio Cannon, had already become a whispered terror throughout the Delmarva Peninsula. The reverse Underground Railroad and serial murder. For almost 2 decades, Cannon had run what historians now refer to as the reverse Underground Railroad, a sophisticated network dedicated to kidnapping free African Americans and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. Her activities, however, weren't confined to human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer who brutally murdered rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children who threatened her operation's security. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, indicate she was indicted for 4 murders, though witness accounts suggest the true toll exceeded 20. Before we continue with the story of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I want to hear from you. What state or city are you listening from? Cannon's criminal network extended far beyond her Delaware base, reaching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment and let me know where you're hearing this story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These dark chapters of American history deserve to be remembered. The surfacing of those buried remains would ultimately dismantle a criminal conspiracy that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade, sheltered by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the painful reality that most of her victims were people whose disappearances were largely unnoticed by white society. The perfect criminal stronghold. The area where Patty Cannon established her empire of terror was uniquely suited for crime. In the early 1800s, the region, now known as Reliance, sat precisely at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strategic location allowed criminals to simply step across county and state lines to evade pursuing lawmen. The location was so remote that locals referred to it as Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that would become the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. The terrain itself seemed designed for concealment. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched for miles, interrupted only by marshy lands and small clearings dotted with isolated farmsteads. The Nanticoke River meandered through the region, offering waterways to transport captives silently under cover of darkness. Roads were barely more than cart paths, and the closest substantial towns were days away by horseback. For anyone seeking to operate outside the law, it was an ideal location. Patty Cannon's origins and domestic life. Martha Cannon, known as Patty by acquaintances, arrived in this borderland around 1790. Court records indicate she was likely born around 1760, possibly named Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she deliberately kept her origins vague. Some reports suggest she was born in Canada and immigrated to Delaware at age 16. What is documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned land near the state line. They had at least 1 daughter and seemingly lived an unremarkable rural life. Jesse Cannon was described by neighbors as a quiet man who kept to himself, cultivating his small farm with tobacco and corn like many other settlers in the area. The Cannon homestead was situated on a modest plot that straddled the Delaware-Maryland border, a detail that would prove vital to Patty's future criminal activities. The house was a simple 2-story structure typical of the period, featuring thick wooden walls and small windows. What neighbors were unaware of was that this seemingly ordinary home would soon house secret rooms and hidden spaces designed to conceal kidnapped human beings. The economic engine of misery. But beneath this surface of normalcy lay a much darker reality. The early 1800s marked a critical moment in American slavery. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, the demand for labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia created a lucrative domestic market. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now commanded over $1,000 in the Deep South. This price surge created powerful incentives for criminals willing to profit from human misery. The economic transformation of the South, fueled by the invention of the cotton gin, generated an insatiable demand for enslaved labor. Cotton production was booming across the Gulf Coast states, and planters were prepared to pay premium prices for workers. Since the legal ban prevented importing slaves from Africa, the only source of new enslaved people was the domestic population, either through natural increase or the capture and re-enslavement of free African Americans. The Delmarva Peninsula was particularly vulnerable to these predators. After the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had been freed by their owners, either through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Maryland and Delaware had significant populations of free African Americans who worked as laborious, artisans, and small farmers. Precarious freedom and criminal opportunity. These legally free communities lived in perpetual fear. They lacked powerful protectors, had limited legal recourse, and their disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated by white authorities who viewed them as less than fully human. The legal status of free African Americans in the early 1800s was tenuous at best. Though not enslaved, they possessed few of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any moment, and they were legally required to carry papers proving their status. For criminals like Patty Cannon, these legal vulnerabilities created prime opportunities for exploitation. Into this volatile environment stepped Patty Cannon, a woman who would prove that evil has no gender limits. Contemporary reports describe her as a large, physically imposing woman with unusual strength for her sex. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women were much shorter, and she possessed what neighbors called an intimidating presence. Her voice was reportedly deep and commanding, and she was known for violent outbursts when defied. Her husband, Jesse, died under mysterious circumstances around 1826. Some later claimed she poisoned him, leaving her a widow with complete control over the family property. By this time, she had already established the criminal connections that would make her name a synonym for terror. Isolation, indifference, and criminal alliance. Local law enforcement was practically non-existent in the rural border region, and the little authority that did exist was often corrupt or simply overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. The region's social dynamics also favored criminal enterprises. The white population was sparse and often transient, consisting mostly of small farmers, laborious, and people seeking to escape their pasts in more settled areas. There was little sense of community cohesion, and neighbors tended to mind their own business, regardless of any suspicions they might harbor about their neighbors' activities. This isolation and indifference were crucial to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for so many years. Patty Cannon's transformation from a frontier widow to a criminal mastermind began with her daughter's marriages, setting a pattern that would define the next 2 decades. Both of the young woman's husbands were slave kidnappers. Her first husband, Henry Brayton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free African Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Brayton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware, for kidnapping, but he managed to escape from jail that same year. The first murder and escalation. Brayton's criminal activities were well known locally long before his arrest. As a blacksmith, he had legitimate reasons to travel the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools. This mobility provided perfect cover for his illegal activities. He would use his legitimate business calls to identify potential victims, noting families with teenagers or young adults who would fetch high prices in southern slave markets. The methods used by early kidnappers like Brayton were often crude but effective. They relied on deception, overwhelming force, and the isolated nature of rural life to capture their victims. A common tactic involved approaching free African American families with offers of employment in distant locations. Parents desperate for economic opportunities for their children would sometimes allow them to travel with these supposed employers, only to realize too late that they had sealed their children's fates. The first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred after Brayton's escape. Brayton, working with Patty Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigidel at Cannon's tavern. The plan was simple and brutal: get the victim drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, then eliminate the witness. Court records confirm that Rigidell was shot and killed during the robbery. Brayton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Patty Cannon escaped prosecution. The Rigidell murder represented a significant escalation in the criminal activities centered on the Cannon property. Before this incident, the family had mainly facilitated kidnappings and provided safe haven for passing criminals. The willingness to commit murder for profit demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that would mark all of Cannon's future actions. The details of the Rigidell crime. Contemporary newspaper accounts of the Rigidell case offer disturbing details. The victim had been traveling through the region with a substantial amount of money, estimated at between $3,000 and $5,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging, unaware he had walked into a trap. The conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Rigidell finally retired to his room, Brayton and Griffith followed. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting and the sound of a struggle, followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigidell was dead, his money was gone, and his wagon and horses had vanished. The body was hastily buried on the property, beginning what would become a regular practice of using the isolated location as a dumping ground for murder victims. The execution of her daughter's first husband did nothing to deter Cannon. Instead, it seemed to refine her methods and strengthen her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she took from Brayton's capture wasn't that crime was futile, but that criminals needed better organization and more careful planning to avoid detection. Joe Johnson and the Strategic Tavern. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable to her criminal enterprise. Johnson was more than just another kidnapper, he was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and, crucially, the capital needed to expand their operations beyond simple opportunistic crimes. Johnson brought a tavern to the partnership located precisely on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This establishment, which became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was so strategically positioned that different rooms literally sat in different states. This geographical advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions to confuse pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portions of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. The tavern served multiple purposes for the expanding criminal operation. It was a legitimate business that provided cover for their activities, generating income and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons. It functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south, with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. And it served as a meeting place for the network of criminals who worked for them, a neutral ground for planning and profit division. The tavern's hidden layout and the diverse gang. The physical layout of the tavern reflected its many functions. The main floor appeared completely normal, with a common room, a bar area, and rooms for legitimate guests. But beneath the building lay a series of cellars and tunnels specifically constructed for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were accessed through concealed entrances and designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls provided anchor points for chains, while small ventilation shafts ensured that captives would not suffocate during long periods of confinement. The gang that formed around Cannon and Johnson was remarkably diverse for its time. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed-race decoys such as John Purnell, who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved people forced to participate in capturing others. This multiracial composition was strategic. African American gang members could approach potential victims without immediately raising suspicion, while white members handled negotiations with buyers in the Deep South. John Purnell, described in court records as a yellow man or mulatto, was particularly valuable. His mixed racial heritage allowed him to move between white and African American communities with relative ease. He maintained multiple identities, presenting himself as either a free person of color seeking work or a light-skinned white man conducting business depending on the situation. This chameleon-like ability made him an ideal scout for identifying potential victims and establishing initial contact. The scale of the operation and Mayor Watson's investigation. As the 1820s progressed, the scope of the Cannon-Johnson operation expanded dramatically. Their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with documented connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker deeply committed to protecting free African Americans, began tracking the disappearances of citizens from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. Watson's investigations exposed the horrifying scale of the operation. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon gang. The victims weren't random targets, they were often specifically chosen for their vulnerability. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable as they could be trained for specific tasks and would provide decades of labor. The systematic nature of these kidnappings demonstrated a level of organization far beyond opportunistic crime. The gang maintained detailed intelligence about potential targets, tracking families and individuals who might be vulnerable. They knew which young people had recently lost their jobs, which families were struggling financially, and which individuals might be tempted by offers of employment in distant locations. Lydia Smith's testimony and the conditions of confinement. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825. Her testimony, preserved in court records, describes being held first in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Smith recalled the constant fear, the inadequate food, and the dreadful knowledge that she was scheduled to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Only her eventual rescue by Watson's network saved her from a lifetime of bondage. Smith's account provides crucial details about the conditions endured by the gang's victims. She described being seized while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers, and transported by wagon to the Delaware-Maryland border. The journey took several days, during which she was kept blindfolded and chained to prevent escape attempts. Upon arrival at the Cannon property, she was placed in a hidden room beneath the main house, where she discovered she was not alone. The underground holding areas, according to Smith's testimony, held dozens of other kidnapped people at various times. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all chained to prevent escape. The conditions were deliberately harsh: inadequate food, no sanitation facilities, and constant darkness, except when guards brought candles during feeding times. Psychological torture and processing human cargo. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical conditions, as captives knew they were destined for sale into lifelong bondage. Smith also detailed the gang's methods for processing their human cargo. Victims were systematically stripped of any documentation proving their free status, and any personal belongings that might help identify them were destroyed. They were given new names and false backgrounds that would support their sale as legitimate slaves. Those who resisted or attempted to maintain their true identities were beaten until they complied. The gang's operations were an open secret in the local community. Neighbors knew that people disappeared near the Cannon property, that wagons arrived at odd hours, and that Johnson's Tavern hosted suspicious meetings. However, the victims were African Americans in a society where their word carried little weight against that of white criminals. Local law enforcement, where it existed, showed little interest in investigating crimes against people they viewed as inherently suspicious. The complicity of the local white community extended beyond mere indifference. Some neighbors actively supported the criminal enterprise, either through direct participation or by providing information about potential victims. Local merchants supplied the gang with provisions, asking no questions about the source of their payment. Even some law enforcement officials were suspected of taking bribes to look the other way when suspicious activities were reported. The shift to white victims and the $35,000 disappearance. This indifference only changed when white victims entered the equation. The gang didn't solely kidnap free African Americans. They also robbed and murdered slave traders who came through their territory carrying large amounts of cash. These victims were white men engaged in the legal slave trade, and their disappearances attracted the attention that African American victims never received. The first documented case occurred around 1820 when a slave trader from Georgia named Bell or Miller vanished while traveling through the area. This man had been carrying a substantial sum of money, some accounts suggest $35,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people. He was last seen at Cannon's establishment, and his horse was later found in her possession. When questioned, Cannon claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of enslaved people, but investigators found this story implausible. The Georgia trader's disappearance signaled the start of a pattern that would ultimately lead to the gang's downfall. Unlike African American victims, whose disappearances generated little official interest, missing white slave traders had business partners and financial backers who demanded investigations. These men carried substantial amounts of money and had planned itineraries that made their disappearances difficult to dismiss. Cannon's brutal methods against rivals. Cannon's method for dealing with these victims was typically brutal. The traders would be invited to the tavern under the guise of conducting legitimate business. Once there, they would be plied with alcohol and encouraged to discuss their financial resources and travel plans. When the opportunity arose, they would be murdered and robbed, their bodies buried on the property, and their money and any enslaved people they were traveling with would be incorporated into the gang's operations. The profits from these murders were substantial. A single slave trader might carry enough money to fund the gang's operations for months. The enslaved people they were transporting could be sold through the gang's southern networks, generating additional income. Most importantly, eliminating these competitors helped the gang maintain their monopoly on criminal activities in the region. Mounting pressure and escalating violence. By the mid-1820s, pressure was mounting on the Cannon-Johnson gang from multiple directions. Mayor Watson of Philadelphia had begun offering substantial rewards for information leading to arrests, and Governor John Andrew Schultzer of Pennsylvania was coordinating with officials in southern states to track kidnapped citizens. Their investigations were revealing not just individual crimes, but a systematic network that had been operating for over a decade. The $500 reward offered by Watson represented a substantial sum for the period, equivalent to several months' wages for most working people. This financial incentive began to loosen tongues in communities that had previously remained silent about the gang's activities. Former associates, dissatisfied gang members, and even some victims who had managed to escape began providing information to authorities. The gang's response to this pressure was characteristically violent. Instead of scaling back their operations, they began eliminating potential witnesses more aggressively. This decision would ultimately prove to be their downfall, as it expanded their list of victims to include people whose disappearances could not be ignored. The paranoia and the role of Cyrus James. The escalation in violence during this period reflected Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid mindset. She had built a criminal empire that generated enormous profits. Estimates suggest the gang's annual income exceeded $50,000, a fortune by early 19th century standards. But this success had made her a target for law enforcement, and she became convinced that former associates posed an existential threat to her operations. The most crucial figure in the gang's eventual exposure was a mixed-race boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had purchased James as a slave when he was only 7 years old and had raised him in her household. As he matured, James was forced to participate in the gang's activities, serving as a decoy to lure other African Americans into traps. His intimate knowledge of the gang's operations, coupled with his growing revulsion at the violence he witnessed, made him both an invaluable asset and a potential liability. James's position in the Cannon household was tragically complex. As an enslaved child, he had no choice but to participate in whatever activities his owner demanded. But as he matured, he began to understand the full horror of what he was being forced to do. He was helping to destroy the lives of people who looked like him, people who shared his heritage and his vulnerability. This knowledge created an internal conflict that would eventually lead him to cooperate with authorities, despite the personal risks. James' testimony and the murder of children. The psychological manipulation employed by Cannon to control James was sophisticated and cruel. She alternated between treating him as a favored member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal masters in the Deep South. She convinced him that his survival depended entirely on her protection and that any betrayal would result in his immediate death. This combination of dependency and terror kept James loyal for years, even as he witnessed increasingly horrific crimes. James later testified that he witnessed Cannon murder multiple children on her property. In one particularly horrific account, he described seeing Cannon take a wounded African-American child, not yet dead, from the house in her apron, only for the child to never return. James knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to help dispose of them. The murders James witnessed were not random acts but calculated decisions based on Cannon's assessment of risk and profit. Children who became sick or injured were killed rather than treated, as medical care would have been expensive and attracted unwanted attention. Young people who proved difficult to control or who maintained their insistence on their free status were eliminated as potential sources of trouble. Even infants born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon determined they would be more trouble than they were worth. The fatal miscalculation and the surfacing bodies. The gang's undoing began with their treatment of rival slave traders. Competition in the illegal human trafficking trade was fierce, and Cannon's gang had developed a reputation for murdering competitors to steal their money and human cargo. This practice accelerated as legitimate law enforcement pressure increased, as dead slave traders couldn't testify about their experiences. The decision to escalate their violence against white victims reflected both Cannon's growing desperation and her fundamental miscalculation about the consequences of such actions. She had operated with impunity for so long that she believed herself untouchable. The murder of African Americans had generated no serious law enforcement response, so she assumed the same would be true for white victims. This assumption would prove fatal to her criminal enterprise. In early 1829, the bodies began to surface. A tenant farmer working land owned by Cannon was plowing a low-lying area that had recently been cleared of brush when his horse stumbled into what proved to be a grave. Inside a wooden chest, he discovered human bones that authorities determined belonged to the missing Georgia slave trader from nearly a decade earlier. This discovery triggered a systematic search of the property that would uncover multiple burial sites. The excavation and James' arrest. The farmer who made the initial discovery was working land that Cannon had rented out for additional income. The area had previously been unused because it was prone to flooding, but recent dry weather had made it suitable for cultivation. When the farmer's plow horse suddenly sank into the ground, he initially assumed he had encountered a natural depression or perhaps an old well. It was only when he began digging to free his horse that he realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister. The wooden chest containing the bones was remarkably well preserved, suggesting it had been buried relatively recently despite containing decade-old remains. The chest itself appeared to have been specifically constructed for concealing a body, with dimensions that precisely accommodated a human form. This level of preparation indicated that the burial was not a hasty attempt to hide a crime, but rather part of a systematic approach to body disposal refined over years of practice. The discovery of the first body in early 1829 set in motion a chain of events that would finally end Patty Cannon's criminal empire. Delaware authorities, working with their counterparts in Maryland, obtained search warrants and began a comprehensive investigation of all properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson gang. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The multi-jurisdictional investigation and James' cooperation. The investigation was led by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, in coordination with Maryland authorities and representatives from the Pennsylvania Governor's Office. This multi-jurisdictional approach was unprecedented for the time and reflected the growing recognition that the Cannon gang's activities crossed state boundaries and required a coordinated law enforcement response. The search warrants obtained were remarkably broad, allowing them to excavate any areas of the Cannon properties where bodies might be concealed. This legal authority was crucial, as it protected investigators who might otherwise have been accused of trespassing or illegal search and seizure. The warrants also specified that any evidence discovered could be used in prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, helping to close the legal loopholes the gang had exploited for years. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was captured in Delaware. The circumstances of his arrest remained somewhat unclear, but court records suggest he was attempting to flee the region when he was apprehended. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of execution, the young man, who had been forced into a life of crime as a child, made a fateful decision: he would cooperate with authorities and reveal everything he knew about Patty Cannon's operations. The decision to cooperate was not made lightly by James. He understood that his testimony would likely result in his own prosecution for the crimes he had been forced to commit. But he also recognized that continued silence would mean protecting the woman who had enslaved him and forced him to participate in the destruction of countless other lives. His cooperation represented not just a legal strategy, but a moral choice to finally break free from the psychological control Cannon had maintained over him for years. Devastating revelations and the child's body. James's testimony was devastating. Speaking to a justice of the peace in Seaford, Delaware, he provided detailed accounts of murders spanning nearly a decade. He told investigators that Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Patty Cannon had shot the Georgia slave trader while he was eating supper at Cannon's house. He had watched them carry the body to a wooden chest and bury it on the property. But this was just the beginning of his revelations. The level of detail in James's testimony was extraordinary, providing investigators with their first comprehensive understanding of the gang's operations. He could describe not just individual crimes, but the systematic methods employed by the gang over many years. He knew the locations of burial sites, the identities of other gang members, the routes used to transport kidnapped people, and the networks of buyers and sellers that stretched across multiple states. Following James's directions, authorities began excavating the Cannon property systematically. In a garden area, they found the body of a young mixed-race child. According to James's testimony, this child had been enslaved by Cannon along with his mother. Cannon had killed the child because she suspected the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. The article preserving this testimony contains no information about the fate of the child's mother, leaving open the horrifying possibility that she, too, was murdered. The discovery of the child's body was particularly disturbing to investigators because it demonstrated the extent of Cannon's callousness. This was not a victim of kidnapping or a rival criminal. This was a child who had been born into Cannon's household.